Have you ever wanted to deeply study the Bible? Maybe you've tried a dozen methods and found yourself still longing to go deeper. It can be intimidating when you're listening to your favorite pastor or Bible nerd, and you feel like you need a master's degree just to study the Bible for yourself. Or maybe you want to understand the customs and historical landscape of the Bible, but don't know where to start. If you can relate, I'm here to help. And if that's not you, I still think you'll find value in this video. You don't need to learn Greek and Hebrew to dig deep into the Word. My name is Hannah, and I'm a missionary and a Bible teacher with the University of the Nations. I study and teach the Bible for my day job, so to keep my heart open to grow and stay connected with God, I use art and creativity in my Bible. And in this video, we'll go through the historical setting and context of the book of Ruth, looking at what the ancient Israelites would have understood when they read Ruth, and setting you up to understand the book for yourself. While we learn, you'll see some of my painting and my study process, but I won't really talk much about the artwork. Let's dive in. Looking at the moment in history when Ruth was written, we see a very different time than our own. A different social structure, a different culture, and a different worldview. I'm hoping to paint a picture of the mindset of the original readers of the book of Ruth. When we read the Bible, we're going on a cross-cultural journey. Let's start with the social structure. Ruth takes place in the time of the Judges. At this time in their history, Israel was a league of tribes that were loosely held together by their shared religion. They had no statehood or king, there was no capital or central administration. The elders of the various clans ruled locally. The only thing that the tribes consistently did together was the pilgrim festivals of Passover, weeks, and booths, which were celebrated annually at the tabernacle, which at this time was in Shiloh. Their society was structured around the home. In the Western world, very few cultures come close to what this actually looked like, since we've undergone thousands of years of both good and bad cultural development. So I'll say the name of their type of society, but you'll need to hold back judgment because our understanding of this social structure is several thousand years removed. Israel was a patriarchal society. In this, we need to put aside our modern understanding of patriarchy. In ancient Near Eastern patriarchal societies, there was absolutely a huge social power gap between men and women. But in our modern zeal to take up arms against the oppressors, we need to pause and remember that our experiences personally or societally were not their experiences. The ancient patriarchal system was about protection and provision and having a family that would be your covering in more ways than one. I really like what Tim Mackey says about our reading of Scripture. He says, when approaching the Hebrew Bible, it's helpful to be aware of our own assumptions and questions, and to pay attention to the intent of the biblical authors. A helpful quote from Dr. John Walton says, even though the Bible was written for us, it wasn't written to us. He says, when we take our Western modern culture and impose it on the text, we're putting in meaning that wasn't there, and we're missing the meaning that the text has. Now, I'm not saying that ancient patriarchy honored women in the way that I might want from my 21st century perspective. But to be frank, in their time period in history, Israel was incredibly forward-thinking and almost radical compared to their contemporaries. Within the ancient patriarchal system, your vocation was dictated by your father's vocation, and was also dictated by your birth order and gender. They were living in a tribe that was made up of clans, which were made up of related households. This is often referred to as the father's house, or Beit Av in Hebrew. This was the core family. Today, the core family in most modern Western cultures is made up of a man and a woman and their children. There are, of course, some variations of this if you're a courageous single parent or a child of divorce. But I can guarantee that in today's age, wives aren't really interested in living with their in-laws. So our modern understanding of core family is essentially who you claim on your taxes. But in ancient Israel, the core family, or Beit Av, consisted of a husband and a wife, their adult sons, their wives, and their children, all living on the multi-generational family farm, all working together to support the whole family. It was communal, not individual. One person's needs did not exceed the needs of the family at large, and children were considered a huge blessing and asset. They were not just mouths to feed. They would grow up and become working hands to advance the community. Each person had a role to play, and each person pretty much stayed in that role. For me, it brings to mind the family Madrigal from the Disney movie Encanto. However, in this movie, it's a matriarch who runs the family instead of a patriarch. Their core family, or Beitav, consisted of Abuela and her 2 daughters and their husbands, and their 6 kids between them, all living in the same house, working together as a whole family. Every member of the family had a role to play, and Abuela was the one who ran the household. Instead of farming, they took on the work of helping strengthen their community and home. In this, each of the children were assets, using their specific gifts towards the same end. Of course, in this example, the family Madrigal was dysfunctional, and Abuela put too much pressure for perfection on her family. But dysfunctionality wouldn't necessarily be the case in every household in Israel. Although Israel did not have a woman running the show, the matriarch did have authority and leadership, but only to the women and female servants in her household. And this authority was given to her from the patriarch, who was almost always the oldest male in the household. The matriarch was usually the wife of the patriarch, but her successor would either be the oldest woman or the wife of the firstborn, if all of the women from the older generation had died. This would cause some tension if a man had more than one wife. Which wife gets to be in charge of the other women? We see many stories in the Old Testament where there would be rivalry between wives, and this is because the wife the patriarch loved most would be given the authority of the matriarchal role. They would all work the same family job. They would also take legal responsibility for each other. There is no police force. It's up to your family to make sure that justice is served. We see in Genesis 34 the terrible story of Dinah and Prince Shechem. Shechem assaulted Dinah and defiled her. Her family was livid. Shechem turned out to really like Dinah and wanted to marry her and make things right. Jacob, who was the patriarch, knew that Dinah was unlikely to get another offer of marriage since she was no longer a virgin. This was a huge problem because the chances of her finding her own Beitav was severely reduced. So Jacob met with Shechem and his father to talk through a potential peace treaty. But before that could be settled, Dinah's brothers tricked Shechem and his father into having their whole town circumcised. And then on the 3rd day afterwards, when all of the men of the town were still recovering, Dinah's brothers killed Shechem and all of his men and conquered the whole city, all because of what Shechem did to their sister. Justice was served by the family. Someone in the family was wronged, and it was the men in her family who punished the perpetrator. The instructions in the law given at Sinai actually gave parameters for more proportionate punishments, so that whole families or tribes would not be punished for smaller offenses. It gave them limits, so that revenge would not rule the nation. If the patriarch was a good one, he would actually put his own life on the line for the sake of those in his care. They were under his protection. We see this when Abraham's nephew Lot was taken captive by enemy armies. It says in Genesis 14:14-16, "When Abraham heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his household, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people." At that time, Lot was a part of Abram's Beit Av, and Abram was the patriarch. It was his duty to rescue Lot because he was responsible for him. Eventually, most Beit Avs would get too big to sustain, so they would split off and create separate households, often remaining connected in a clan. Israel had 12 tribes, and each tribe had one patriarchal leader. That person held a lot of authority, and the 12 tribes together were the nation of Israel. It's really helpful to understand the way their society was structured because it's so different from our own. Okay, so there was 3 parts defining Israel's patriarchal system. Patriarchy, which is about who has the authority. This is the first part. Then the second part is about lineage, or what is called patrilineal. This is the tracing of ancestral descent or inheritance through the male line. A super simplified version of this idea is that of taking the male's last name. For example, I have 3 older brothers. Each of their wives chose to take my father's last name, while I, who share DNA with my father, no longer carry his last name. I took on my husband's father's name, and our daughter has my husband's last name. In Israel, it wasn't specifically names that they took on, but women joined the household of their husbands, whether he was the Beit Av or not. If I lived in ancient Israel and got taken captive by an enemy, it would be my father-in-law's responsibility to rescue me, not my birth father. They passed inheritance through the male line. This is why it's rare to see a woman mentioned in a genealogy, because genealogies were concerned with keeping track of the bloodline and tracing the inheritance. Many people don't realize that the reason the firstborn received a double portion of the inheritance is because he would become the patriarch and would need that inheritance to take care of the whole family system. The two primary resources at this time were children and land. Children, not like little kids, just descendants, were a resource because this was a farming community. The bigger your family numbers, the more laborers you had to take care of the livestock and crops. The women would work in and around the home, spinning and weaving fibers into cloth, making and mending clothing, gathering firewood and often water, grinding grain into flour, pressing oil, baking, cooking, and child rearing. When the boys were old enough, they would join their brothers, cousins, uncles, and fathers in the field with the grain or livestock. Women would also help during the harvest time, binding up the sheaves into stooks and winnowing on the threshing floor. With all of this work that had to happen to sustain the family, you can imagine how useful more hands would be, and that offspring were a resource. And the third part of the patriarchal system deals with the other primary resource, the land. This is something called patrilocal. They collectively farm the land and jointly share its produce, so they all live on the family land, but not necessarily in the same physical house. There was usually a main house, and then each of the sons would build another house on the same property, and then the grandsons would build their houses on that same land, and so on and so on. Their land was what they worked to be able to survive. And for Israel, this was more than just real estate. It was the very inheritance that God had given them. Possession of the Promised Land was part of the covenantal agreement made at Sinai. In the book of Joshua, there's chapters and chapters about what land belonged to which tribe and clan. This was why the genealogies were so important. It traced who the land belonged to in Israel. Something else that was different in ancient Israel is that they were not allowed to change their property lines. The land given to a specific clan in Joshua was the same land that the clan still possessed when David was king, hundreds of years later. The point was that Israel wasn't allowed to expand their borders into the territory of their brothers. They weren't allowed to sell their land permanently either. The Lord says in Leviticus 25, verses 23 through 28, that the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess you shall allow a redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells a part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he sold it, and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. But if he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. So here we see that they were not allowed to sell their land permanently. Every 50 years it would be restored to the original owners, so that the original tribal allotments God gave them in Joshua would be preserved. This is why tracing patrilineal inheritance and descent was crucial to their way of life. Okay, so to recap this section, ancient Israel lived in a patriarchal society, the father's house, or Beit Av. And this was your safety net. It was your protection, your legal system, your provision, your inheritance, your retirement, and your family. Your family was who you worked alongside of, and the person who carried all of the responsibility was your patriarch. It was their job to take care of the family and assign roles, and if anything went wrong, they took the burden on to fix it. And you don't have to pay a mortgage because this land has belonged to your family for almost 400 years. That's all for this section. We'll paint and chat more about Ruth in the next video. I'd love to hear from you though. Currently, who's your favorite character in the Bible and why? And as always, if you found this content valuable, please like and subscribe. This really helps the algorithm get these videos out to the right people. I'll see you next time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.